The Mongol Empire invaded Kievan Rus in the 13th century, destroying numerous cities, including Ryazan, Kolomna, Moscow, Vladimir, and Kiev. Part of the Mongol invasion of Europe. The campaign was heralded by the Battle of the Kalka River in April 1223, which resulted in a Mongol victory over the forces of several Rus principalities. The Mongols nevertheless retreated. A full-scale invasion of Ryazan by Batu Khan followed, from 1237 to 1240. The invasion was ended by the Mongol succession process upon the death of Bkkbrad Khan. All Ryazan principalities were forced to submit to Mongol rule and became part of the Golden Horde Empire, some of which lasted until 1480. The invasion, facilitated by the beginning breakup of Kievan Rus in the 13th century, had incalculable ramifications for the history of Eastern Europe, including the division of the East Slavic people into three separate nations: modern-day Russia, Ukraine, and Belarus, and in the rise of the Grand Duchy of Moscow. Background: as it was undergoing fragmentation, Kievan Rus faced the unexpected eruption of an irresistible foreign foe coming from the mysterious regions of the Far East. For our sins, writes the Rus chronicler of the time, unknown nations arrived. No one knew their origin or whence they came, or what religion they practiced. That is known only to God, and perhaps to wise men learned in books. The princes of Rus first heard of the coming Mongol warriors from the nomadic humans. Previously known for pillaging settlers on the frontier, the nomads now preferred peaceful relations, warning their neighbors, "These terrible strangers have taken our country, and tomorrow they will take yours if you do not come and help us." In response to this call, Mstislav the Bold and Mstislav Romanovich the Old joined forces and set out eastward to meet the foe, only to be routed on April 1, 1223 at the Battle of the Kalka River. Although this defeat left the Rus principalities at the mercy of invaders, the Mongol forces retreated and did not reappear for 13 years, during which time the princes of Rus went on quarreling and fighting as before, until they were startled by a new and much more formidable invading force. In the secret history of the Mongols, the only reference to this early battle is, "Then he sent Dorbay the Fierce off against the city of Merv, and on to conquer the people between Iraq and the Indus. He sent Subete the Brave off to war in the north where he defeated 11 kingdoms and tribes, crossing the Volga and Ural rivers, finally going to war with Kiev." Invasion of Batu Khan. The vast Mongol hordes of around 35,000 mounted archers, commanded by Batu Khan and Subutai, crossed the Volga River and invaded Volga Bulgaria in the autumn of 1236. It took them a year to extinguish the resistance of the Volga Bulgarians, the Cumans, Kipchaks, and the Alani. In November 1237, Batu Khan sent his envoys to the court of Yuri II of Vladimir and demanded his submission. A month later, the hordes besieged Ryazan. After 6 days of bloody battle, the city was totally annihilated. Alarmed by the news, Yuri II sent to his sons to detain the invaders, but they were soundly defeated. Having burnt down Kolomna in Moscow, the horde laid siege to Vladimir on February 4, 1238. 3 days later, the capital of Vladimir Suzdal was taken and burnt to the ground. The royal family perished in the fire, while the Grand Prince retreated northward. Crossing the Volga, he mustered a new army, which was totally annihilated by the Mongols in the Battle of the Sich River on March 4. Thereupon Batu Khan divided his army into smaller units, which ransacked 14 cities of modern-day Russia: Rostov, Uglich, Yaroslavl, Kostromar, Kashan, Kazny-Atan, Gorodets, Gallik, Peroslavl, Zaleski, Yuria-Polsky, Dimitrov, Volokolamsk, Tver, and Torzhok. Chinese siege engines were used by the Mongols under Tului to raise the walls of Russian cities. The most difficult to take was the small town of Kozulsh, whose boy Prince Vasily, son of Titus, and inhabitants resisted the Mongols for 7 weeks, killing 4,000. As the story goes, at the news of the Mongol approach, the whole town of Kitish with all its inhabitants was submerged into a lake, where, as legend has it, it may be seen to this day. The only major cities to escape destruction were Novgorod and Pskov. The Mongols were advancing on Novgorod but unexpectedly turned back at the site mentioned as Ignatkros, of which the exact location is not known. Refugees from southern Rus moved mostly to the northeast, into the forested region with poor soils between the upper Volga and the Oka rivers. In the summer of 1238, Batu Khan devastated the Crimea and pacified Mordovia. In the winter of 1239, he sacked Chernigov and Pereyaslav. After many days of siege, the horde stormed Kiev in December 1240. Despite the resistance of Danilo of Halych, Batu Khan managed to take 2 of his principal cities, Halych and Volodymyr-Vilinskaya. The Mongols then resolved to reach the ultimate sea, where they could proceed no further, and invaded Hungary and Poland. The age of Tatar rule. This time, the invaders came to stay, and they built for themselves a capital, called Surai, on the lower Volga. Here the commander of the Golden Horde, as the western section of the Mongol Empire was called, fixed his golden headquarters and represented his sovereign the Grand Khan, who lived with the Great Horde in the Orkhon Valley. Here they had their headquarters and held parts of Rus in subjection for nearly 3 centuries. All of the Russian states, including Novgorod, Smolensk, Galician, and Pskov, submitted to the Tatar-Mongol rule. The term by which this subjection is commonly designated, the Mongol or Tatar joke, suggests terrible oppression. But in reality these nomadic invaders from Mongolia were not such cruel, oppressive taskmasters. In the first place, they never settled in the country, and they had little direct dealing with the inhabitants. In accordance with the admonitions of Genghis Khan to his children and grandchildren, they retained their pastoral mode of life, so that the subject races, agriculturists, and dwellers in towns were not disturbed in their ordinary avocations. Golden Horde instituted census, taxes and tributes on the conquered lands, which were usually collected by local princes and brought to Surai. It was only in the 14th and 15th centuries, with the rise of the Tatar Khanates, that slave raids on the Slavic population became significant, with the purpose of trading slaves with the Ottoman Empire. The raids were an important drain of the human and economic resources of both Muscovy and the Grand Duchy of Lithuania, and they largely prevented the settlement of the wild fields, the steppe and forest steppe land extending from about 100 miles south of Moscow to the Black Sea, and they ultimately contributed to the development of the Cossacks. In religious matters, the Mongols were extremely tolerant. When they first appeared in Europe, they were shamanists, and as such they had no religious fanaticism. After adopting Islam they remained as tolerant as before, and the Khan of the Golden Horde, who first became a Muslim, allowed the Ryazan to found a Christian bishopric in his capital. Nogai Khan, half a century later, married a daughter of the Byzantine emperor, and gave his own daughter in marriage to a Rus prince, Theodore the Black. Some modern Russian historians even postulate that there was no invasion at all. According to them, the Ryazan princes concluded a defensive alliance with the Horde in order to repel attacks of the fanatical Teutonic Knights, which posed a much greater threat to the Ryazan religion and culture. These points represent the bright side of Tatar rule, but it also had its dark side. So long as a great horde of nomads was encamped on the frontier, the country was liable to be invaded by an overwhelming force. Fortunately, these invasions were not frequent, but when they occurred they caused an incalculable amount of devastation and suffering. In the intervals the people had to pay a fixed tribute. At first it was collected in a rough-and-ready fashion by Tatar tax-gatherers. By about 1259 it was regulated by a census of the population, and, finally its collection was entrusted to the native princes. so the people were no longer brought into direct contact with the Tatar officials. Impact on development. The influence of the Mongol invasion on the territories of Kievan Rus was uneven. Colin Bkkbrad estimates the population of Rus had dropped from 7.5 million prior to the invasion to 7 million afterwards. Centers such as Kiev took centuries to rebuild and recover from the devastation of the initial attack. The Novgorod Republic continued to prosper, however, and new entities, the rival cities of Moscow and Tver, began to flourish under the Mongols. Indeed, Moscow's eventual dominance of northern and eastern Rus was in large part attributable to the Mongols. After the Prince of Tver joined a rebellion against the Mongols in 1327, his rival Prince Ivan I of Moscow joined the Mongols in crushing Tver and devastating its lands. By doing so, he eliminated his rival, allowed the Russian Orthodox Church to move its headquarters to Moscow, and was granted the title of Grand Prince by the Mongols. As such, the Muscovite prince became the chief intermediary between the Mongol overlords and the Rus lands, which paid further dividends for Moscow's rulers. While the Mongols often raided other areas of Rus, they tended to respect the lands controlled by their principal collaborator. This, in turn, attracted nobles and their servants who sought to settle in the relatively secure and peaceful Moscow lands. Although Rus forces defeated the Golden Horde at the Battle of Kulikovo in 1380, Mongol domination of parts of Rus' territories, with the requisite demands of tribute, continued until the Great Stand on the Ugra River in 1480. It has been argued that without the Mongol destruction of Kievan Rus, the Tsardom of Russia and subsequently the Russian Empire would not have risen. Trade routes with the East came through the Rus lands, making them a center for trade from both worlds. Mongol influence, while destructive to their enemies, had a significant long-term effect on the rise of modern Russia, Ukraine, and Belarus. Influence on Rus society. Historians have debated the long-term influence of Mongol rule on Rus society. The Mongols have been blamed for the destruction of Kievan Rus, the breakup of the ancient Rus nationality into three components, and the introduction of the concept of Oriental despotism into Russia. Historians also credit the Mongol regime with an important role in the development of Muscovy as a state. Under Mongol occupation, for example, Muscovy developed its Mestny Chestvo hierarchy, postal road network, census, fiscal system, and military organization. The period of Mongol rule over Russia included significant cultural and interpersonal contacts between the Russian and Mongolian ruling classes. By 1450, the Tatar language had become fashionable in the court of the Grand Prince of Moscow, Vasily II, who was accused of excessive love of the Tatars and their speech, and many Russian noblemen adopted Tatar surnames. Many Russian boyar families traced their descent from the Mongols or Tatars, including Veliaminovzanov, Godunov, Arseniev, Bakhmatev, Bulgakov, and Chardav. In a survey of Russian noble families of the 17th century, over 15% of the Russian noble families had Tatar or Oriental origins. The Mongols brought about changes in the economic power of states and overall trade. In the religious sphere, Saint Paphnutius of Borovsk was the grandson of a Mongol Barskark, or tax collector, while a nephew of Khan Burgai of the Golden Horde converted to Christianity and became known as the Monk Street. Peter Tsarevich of the Horde. In the judicial sphere, under Mongol influence, capital punishment, which during the times of Kievan Rus had only been applied to slaves, became widespread, and the use of torture became a regular part of criminal procedure. Specific punishments introduced in Moscow included beheading for alleged traitors and branding of thieves.